Welcome back to Lesson 2 on Positive Change. Now I want to begin this session by reading to you a testimonial from a young girl that I received a couple of years ago. And truth be told, I received quite a lot of these emails pretty much on a weekly basis. This young girl says this: earlier this year, I had a very severe episode of depression in which I was twice admitted to hospital. While staying there, my dad came and gave me your book. At that time, I was having a lot of difficulty with concentration and accepted only out of politeness. But when I began to read it, I actually just couldn't put it down. I finished reading it within a couple of days with a new realization I had a bright and hopeful future. Then she says, this is after reading the book, I met a girl in my ward. We started having a chat, and she told me her deep desire to end her life. She was convinced she could live past 16. I told her about your book and I offered it to her that night. She said she didn't want down till morning, and the next day when I saw her, she put her arms around me and said, that book just saved my life. Now the reason why I'm sharing that story with you is because I want you to understand the heart in which I'm actually preparing this presentation for you with. Because once you understand the position that I actually stand in and that my whole goal is to actually really help you, I think you will receive this information on a whole nother level. So, what is my definition of positive change? It's this. It's our ability to see the positive and the possible in a fluid, uncertain, and connected world. Our ability to see the positive and the possible. About a few months ago, while we were all in quarantine, I was scouring my bookcase and I came across a really, really old book. It's like 50 years old, by a guy by the name of Alvin Toffler. He wrote a book called Future Shock. And in that book, he defined future shock as the shattering stress and disorientation that we induce in individuals by subjecting them to too much change in too short a period of time. That was written 50 years ago, when the rate of change seems slothful when compared to today. He also wrote in that book this really fascinating idea. He said that the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but it will be those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. That's the day that we're living in today, because change is actually so rapid. Now, this seminar, or this section of the seminar, I want to give you a little bit of a history lesson. And I'm going to take you through the last 60 years. I'm going to do it for you in the next, say, 10 minutes. Now, here's the deal. I've broken these videos, these 7 videos, into 8-minute sections. This one's going to go a little bit longer, but I want to lay the foundation here. I'm going to take you on a journey through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, into the noughties, and right up until now, and help you understand why so many people today feel like they feel. So let's begin. If you've got a pen and paper handy, I'd encourage you to write notes. That will not only help keep you engaged, but also give you some key ideas as we're moving through this seminar that you can then adopt to your life and share with those around about you. So let's begin. Let's start way back in the 1960s. Now, one of the major events that happened during the 1960s was, of course, the rise of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement showed a generation of young people that, hey, listen, if you're willing to stand up and speak out against something, then you can change the world through the power of speech and through the power of communication. And young people growing up in the 60s learned to be inspired by their leaders, who through great oratory ability were able to communicate amazing truths. Another major event that happened in the 1960s was, of course, Beatles mania. The Fab Four from London revolutionized the world with their songs, melodies, and lyrics. In fact, EMI recently estimated the Beatles actually sold close to 1 billion records, making them the highest grossing recording artists of all time. Another major event that happened in the 1960s was, of course, Landing Man on the Moon. Now, Landing Man on the Moon showed a generation that, hey, listen, if you're willing to aim for the impossible, well, then you might just get it. And young people growing up during the 60s learned to be inspired by their leaders who dreamt impossible dreams but made those impossible dreams become a reality. Now, the 1970s are vastly different. One of the major icons of the 1970s was, of course, a rise of a cute little iconic family of which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, right? That family was, of course, anybody? The Brady Bunch, a nice little icon of the 1970s. Another icon of the 1970s was this particular pop group called, anybody? ABBA. In 1974, ABBA sung Waterloo at the Eurovision contest, which pretty much catapulted this band into utter stardom. Now, if the Beatles have sold 1 billion records, ABBA have actually sold half that much, 500 million records, but it still ranks them in the top 10 recording artists of all time. So out of the 60s and 70s, we see some of the greatest musical influences that we have today. Now let me be really clear about the 70s. In the 70s, they did not have Xbox Connect, Sony PlayStation 4, Game Boy, DS or Wii. They had something far better. One of the latest piece of technologies, the top of the Christmas list for every single young person growing up in the 1970s was, of course, Etch-a-Sketch, and everyone wanted one because the latest piece of technology back in the 1970s. Now the 1980s. For those of you taking notes, many sociologists and psychologists call the 80s an age of denial. The 80s, an age of denial. One of the reasons for that is, of course, the rise of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Now, I don't know if you realize this, but since 1981, 35 million people are dead. And every 6 seconds someone becomes infected. But the governments of the day try to push it aside, tried to say it's only the disease that affects a small part of the population, until today we're living in denial about it, aren't we? For instance, are you familiar with Bono from U2? Bono said this at a concert recently. He said this. He said, right now, there is the biggest pandemic happening in the history of the civilized world with AIDS. 6,500 Africans are dying every single day of a preventable, treatable disease. 6,500 Africans. You know what that is? That's 2 9/11s happening in Africa every day. Yet Bono goes on to say this, yet there are no tears of condolence, there are no 51 gun salutes, there are no silent moments or days of remembrance for these Africans. Why? Because he said most people don't place the same value on an African life as they do on an American, a European, even an Australian. An age of denial. Another reason why it's called an age of denial, so obviously because of the Exxon Valdez incident that occurred, where a container ship hit a reef. The captain of the ship tried to add in a little bit of oil, ended up being 11 million gallons that spilt out to show the ecosystem in that particular area. Until today we'll deny about it, aren't we? In fact, this latest spill in the Gulf of Mexico, that actually emitted 250 million gallons. 11 million gallons every 4 days, so we're still learning from our mistakes, right? But can't I be really clear about the 80s? Because the 80s was when I grew up. This was when I was a teenager. Clearly medical tragedies, clearly environmental tragedies. But you know what may have just been one of the worst tragedies in the 1980s? And I know some of my friends actually still live with the scars. Some of my friends are show these next images still tremble and shake. Some of my friends are actually still in counselling because of the horrors that it brings back. One of the worst tragedies in the 1980s may have just been this. That was, of course, the tragedies of fashion. Now I'm joking, right? I just need to put in a circuit breaker before we actually move on. Now the 1990s. Rolling Stone magazine put out an edition of every major event that happened in the mid-1990s that affected people. As I'm flicking through the magazine, I'm noticing a very startling picture starting to emerge. Let's just see if you can pick up on that same picture. Now the first article I came across in this Rolling Stone magazine was an article about a young guy by the name of River Phoenix. River Phoenix was in a club called the Viper Room in LA on the Sunset Strip. When around 1 a.m. on the dance floor, River Phoenix started to shake and convulse fairly violently. So much so that the bouncers picked him up and threw him outside on the sidewalk. There he continued to shake and convulse. By the time the ambulance got there, River Phoenix, this 23-year-old actor, was pronounced dead. They found in his system a drug called GBH. The street term for that is called grievous bodily harm. That is exactly what this drug inflicted on River Phoenix. River Phoenix was a well-known actor, about to sign a major motion picture deal, but at 23 years of age, his life ended. Not just his life, his dreams, his goals, and his purpose. You know what Rolling Stone tried to label the generation in the 1990s? They tried to call it this, ready? A lost hope for a lost generation. You see, I believe this. If you tell a generation of young people that actually came from nothing, that they live for no reason, and that they're going nowhere, then guess what? They'll actually start to act like it, they'll actually start to believe it. The next article I came across in this Rolling Stone magazine was an article about one of the most talented and the most gifted musicians of this era. This guy was like the poster boy, right? He was like the icon of the 1990s, and that was, of course, Kurt Cobain. But in 1994, Kurt Cobain walked the wooden steps to a room above his garage, smoked 6 cigarettes, injected a triple dose of heroin, then put a gun to his head and took his own life. Talented, gifted. Nobody could capture the essence of a generation and bottle it like he could. Yet at the height of his career, he chose to self-destruct. Now, if you want to know why somebody would do something as silly as this, you only need to listen to their words, right? Here's some of Kurt Cobain's lyrics. They go like this. Take a step outside yourself and turn around. Take a look at who you are. It's pretty scary, so silly. It's revolting. You're not much if you are anything at all. You'll begin to escalate during the period of the mid-1990s. Anorexia, self-harm, people cutting themselves, hurting themselves, self-loathing and self-destruction went to all-time highs during the period of the mid-1990s. Then I'm sure you're familiar with many of the mass shootings that occurred recently in America. When that Orlando nightclub, that Sandy Hook Primary School, last year in Florida, or recently in Las Vegas, that all started way back here. I'm trying to paint a pattern for you. So way back here with Columbine High School, where 2 young boys walked into their high school, shot dead 13 of their classmates, and then took their own lives. Lastly, and again, if you tell a generation of people that actually came from nothing, that they live for no reason, they're going nowhere, and guess what? They'll actually start to act like it, they'll actually start to believe it. In fact, I just recently came across a diary entry from one of the Columbine killers, and the diary entry went like this. The human race isn't worth fighting for, only worth killing. Give the earth back to the animals. They deserve it infinitely more than what we do. Nothing means anything anymore. That's the line. Nothing means anything anymore. What we have today is a crisis of purpose. We'll be talking about that also a little bit later. Now, let me give you a quick recap. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I feel it's necessary for us to talk about the problem before we get to the solution. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm not one of these guys that buries their head in the sand, says none of this stuff exists. Now let's talk about all of the stuff that's actually affecting us emotionally and mentally, and then let's try and come up with the solution. But if we don't actually face the problems, we're never going to come to the solutions. So here's my one and only recap. The 60s. Some have called it an age of earnest effort. The 60s, earnest effort. The 70s is an age of shifting values. The 80s, like I said, the 80s, an age of denial. The 90s, some sociologists, psychologists call the 90s, they've labeled that an age of hopelessness. The 90s, an age of hopelessness. If the 90s is called an age of hopelessness, then my hypothesis would be this. You'd have to call the noughties right up until the 10s, you'd have to label that an age of despair, right? The noughties, an age of despair. You might be asking, well, what are you talking about? Let me run through some of the events that we've literally grown up with over the last 20 years, and you tell me by the end if you don't actually agree. Now, I'm going to start right at the start of the turn of the century, and then we'll come right up till now, because I need you to know where the cultural shift happened. Because I cannot talk to you about ISIS unless we first go back and talk about 9/11. You know, those two planes flew into the World Trade Center. People that couldn't get down actually ran up. They actually ran up in the belief that someone would come and find them. No one came. So 200 people smashed doors and windows and then jumped 100 stories down. Imagine the level of despair that would grip your heart for you to do something like that. Then there was, of course, the event that brought it closer to home for us, right? Here in Australia with the Bali bombings. What happened was outside Paddy's Irish pub, where young people tried to enjoy drinking the meal. Outside one of the pubs, a small bomb explodes, forcing young people in the street. 15 seconds later, across the road at the Sari Club, another bomb explodes, again forcing young people in the street. All these young people on the street were confused and dazed. A Mitsubishi van filled with explosives erupts, sending shrapnel everywhere, killing people instantly. A wall of fire incinerates the entire neighbourhood. One writer writes about it as a quagmire of death, despair, and destruction. Then, of course, there was the event that made Columbine look tame, right? That was, of course, the Beslan school siege. When on the first day of school, 1,300 people were taken hostage inside of a school hall, 334 people killed, killing 186 innocent children. Then there was, of course, the event that shook the planet with despair. And the whole world fell on the weight of the despair as the ripples from this event touched every shore. That was, of course, the Boxing Day tsunami. 283,000 deaths occurred. Listen, I don't have time to go through everything else in detail, so I'm going to just flick through these and give you the highlights. And I have time, literally, going to talk to you about hurricanes, earthquakes, droughts, famines, wars, floods, cyclones. In fact, before we get to these recent bushfires, can we just go back and reflect on the last ones that occurred in 2009? I also don't have time to go and talk about, the great celebrity meltdown that's occurring at the moment. And think about this, we actually have celebrities today who seemingly have everything to live with, but maybe nothing to actually live for. Oh, they've got the means, but just no meaning. I also don't have to come to talk about the GFC, remember, or Haiti, or Pakistan, or the recent quake that occurred in Japan, the tragedy that happened in Norway, or any of the mass shootings. This is just a small sampling just from 2012. It's not actually all of them. In fact, in 2014, many of you would realize this, not in 1914, but in 2014, not the Great War, but just recently, there are actually 171 million people affected by civil conflict on this planet. And what I like to do every year is I lay out all my Time magazine covers on my gym floor. Can we just look at some of the highlights from 2014? And then if we layered like 2015 over the top with the bombings in Paris, the refugee crisis, or what was going on in Syria. In fact, there was one picture, I didn't even have space to put it on this slide. Do you remember in 2015 when that black guy got shot in the back by a police officer in 2015? And they started a campaign, what was it? Hashtag Black Lives Matter. Can you please explain to me why in 2015 do we actually have to start a campaign that Black Lives Matter? Shouldn't we already know that by now? And think about this, they started that campaign in a country where at the time, the president was actually black. You know what they've said about the world that we've grown up in at the moment? You'd be very familiar with this. It says that we've grown up in a VUCA world. What is a VUCA world? It is a world that is volatile, it is a world that is uncertain, it is a world that is complex, and it is a world that is ambiguous. All this change happening all the time. And just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, and then 2016 happened. And who would have thought at an Ariana Grande concert that 22 people would actually lose their lives in Manchester? And then in 2018 was actually the worst year ever for high school massacres. You would think it would start to be getting better, but in actual fact, it's actually getting worse. And then with 2019 and the horrors that we're now only beginning to find out with Epstein. Then there was, of course, the fires in the Amazon in 2019, which spread across to California. And then, as we saw earlier this year in 2020, here in Australia with the bushfires. And then COVID-19, the pandemic that occurred, and the change and the quarantine and the social distancing, all these new terms. Change is happening rapidly at the moment. It seems to have accelerated only more so even in the last 6 months. And then we had the many complexities of what was going on in America with George Floyd. And I actually had somebody come up to me recently when I was delivering this, and they said, yeah, but Glenn, you don't understand. There were wars in the 70s. Celebrities took their lives in the 80s. Nothing's really changed. Now, you know what's changed? Is that today we have 24-hour news stations and Twitter feeds feeding it to us live, minute by minute by minute by minute by minute. Because we've gone from a local community to a global community. We've gone from linear growth to exponential growth, and our minds can't cope with the rate at which we're getting fed all of this change. So many people today live in a heightened state of anxiety, panic, and stress. Because there are all these alarming things happening all around the world. And social media gives us the potential to put all those alarming things in front of us all the time. So instead of hearing about one thing happening locally, we hear about 200 things happening all across the world, which puts our biology in a state of emergency because we don't know how to calibrate all this information or which catastrophe is the one actually worth paying attention to. In fact, Time magazine called it the decade from hell. And for many people, in many ways, it actually really was. And since I don't have time to talk about all those things in detail, can I say this one thing? Do you know what I believe the number one question people are asking at this time? And don't get offended by the question. In fact, the answer to this question isn't necessary for us to thrive in today's modern society. And during this presentation, I'm going to help you come up with an answer to this question. People today were saying this: if life is so fragile, if life can be taken away from me so quickly, if life is nothing but a vapor, then here's the question, ready? What makes life worth living? What makes life, what's the point? What's the meaning? With all this change, what's the meaning of all of this? In fact, Friedrich Nietzsche said this. He said, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. Then in the last 10 years of this decade, we've seen nothing but rapid change. Would you agree with him? The pace of life just seems getting faster and faster and faster. Everyone's just like crazy busy, right? Life is far more complicated. Family structure is that we've got mixed families, blended families, single parent families. Hey, nothing wrong with any of that. With all this change and then no sense of community. See, we used to be able to anchor ourselves. Remember when family was stable? Remember when politics, for some people, was stable, and then Brexit and Trump happened? Remember when, religion, for some people, was stable? See, here's the deal. The problem today is not that the boat is rocking. The problem today is many people don't have any anchors. We need to find an anchor. When we're faced with so much change, it is vital for us to find an anchor. Otherwise, we won't be able to see what's possible and what's positive in the world today. In fact, then, and I don't mean to be barking up the tree of social media, but we all need to understand what it's actually doing to us emotionally, right? Social media has basically amplified all 7 of the deadly sins. Envy? Absolutely. Anger? Hey, don't we live in the age of outrage? Everybody's outraged about something, and social media has amplified this. When we see somebody post something that we think is ridiculous and stupid, we get offended and feel the need to speak back about it. Pride, lust, gluttony, greed, and sloth all have been amplified. A neuroscientist said this about social media. He said, we have begun to live in a world where we eat content, drink content, and breathe content. There's a reason why it's called a feed. Without giving a single thought to its composition and what kind of impact it has upon our lives. Unmoderated content consumption is as dangerous as the consumption of sewage water. We're consuming all of this stuff and it's unmoderated. And many of us are wondering why we don't have any peace in our world and why we're quick to respond in negative ways and why we have such a low level of emotional intelligence. We've lost our calmness. We've lost our ability almost to be rational because we don't realize we're responding to something that we saw even last week. You know, last Christmas, I ate a whole tub of connoisseur ice cream. And can I tell you something? I didn't feel sick while I was eating it. But a few hours later, I started to experience the pain of what I'd just done. We see all this social media, we don't realize it's sometimes a week later, sometimes hours later, we're still suffering from the effects. And all of this has led to a worldwide epidemic, one I'm sure you're all very familiar with, and it's called this, right? Depression. Depression is now the leading cause of death and disability around the world. Not heart disease, not cancer, not road accidents, but as of 2017, depression is now the leading cause of death and disability around the world. Now, I said all that to say this. Now remember, I said to you we had to talk about the problems. If we don't talk about the problems, then we're never going to get to the solutions. Now that I brought that all to the surface, let me just say this. Despite all of what I've just described, can I tell you something? I'm incredibly hopeful about the people living in today's modern world. And you know the reason why? It's because of this. Ready? Now, do I need to unpack that anymore? Actually, can I just say this? If you want to make anything strong, if you want to make a person strong, if you want to make a marriage strong, you make a muscle strong, you know what you have to do? You have to put it under some resistance. Now, can you please tell me, on what rep do you think your muscle will grow the most when you work it out in the gym? Would it grow the most on rep 1? Or would it grow the most on rep 10? The answer is, of course, 11. You know when you can't go any further? You know when you reach the point of failure? You know when you feel like your muscles can't go anymore? That's when the muscle grows the most. This generation of people haven't realized, can I tell you something honestly, and when you listen clearly to this, you are stronger than what you know. You're more capable than what you know. You've got what you've had to experience, what you've had to encounter. You're more resilient than you could even imagine. In fact, I want you to write down this one phrase, and then we're going to close this seminar off. He says this, and this is just a one line I want you to take out of this. Ready? The kind of hope I think about is this. Hope is not a state of the world. Hope is actually a state of mind. Hope is not a state of the world, it's actually a state of mind. In 20 years of speaking about hope, I've put together a little bit of a formula on it, and it goes like this. Because for me, it all starts with hope. Because once we're hopeful, because I tell you something, when I'm hopeful, I'm far better than when I'm hopeless. Because when I'm hopeful, I'm more resilient, I am more creative, I'm more insightful, I'm more empowered. When I experience life through the lens of hope. So it all starts with hope. Because with hope comes meaning. Meaning fosters empowerment, focus and unity. The collective outcome of this is action, and this leads to growth for people and for organizations. I want you to see this world through the lens of hope. Abraham Maslow, and I'll finish with this, made a really powerful statement a number of years ago. He said this: in any given moment, we have two options. To step forward into growth or to step back into safety. Growth must be chosen again and again, and fear must be overcome again and again. I cannot wait to see you in the next session. We're going to start to unpack this, and I'm going to give you the 5 superpowers of positive change. Hope to see you soon. Take care.